Julia stared at the holographic display floating above Professor Martinez's desk, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The intricate double helix rotated slowly, sections highlighted in different colors representing various genetic sequences. What captivated her attention, however, was the substantial portion marked in deep crimson representing viral DNA that had somehow become a permanent part of human genetic code. 8%, Professor Martinez repeated, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent studying molecular biology. That's how much of your DNA comes from ancient viruses that your ancestors survived. Oscar leaned forward in his chair beside Julia, his notebook forgotten as he absorbed this revelation. As a computer science major, he was used to thinking about code, but this biological programming seemed far more complex and mysterious than anything he'd encountered in his algorithms classes. But how is that even possible? Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had always prided herself on understanding complex biological concepts. It was why she'd chosen to major in genetics, but this seemed to challenge everything she thought she knew about human evolution. Professor Martinez smiled knowingly. He had seen this expression countless times on students' faces when they first encountered the concept of endogenous Think of it this way, he began, manipulating the hologram to zoom in on one of the crimson sections. When a retrovirus infects a cell, it doesn't just replicate and move on. It actually inserts its genetic material directly into the host cell's DNA. Oscar's analytical mind immediately began processing this information. So it's like malicious code that gets permanently installed in a computer's operating system. That's actually a brilliant analogy. Professor Martinez nodded approvingly. Except in this case, sometimes that malicious code ends up serving a purpose. Over millions of years, some of these viral sequences have been repurposed by evolution to serve beneficial functions. Julia felt a chill run down her spine as she contemplated the implications. Every cell in her body, every breath she took, every thought she had, all of it was influenced by genetic material from viruses that had once threatened to destroy her ancestors. It was simultaneously horrifying and fascinating. Take pregnancy, for example, Professor Martinez continued, highlighting another section of the genetic code. There's a protein called syncytin that's crucial for placental development. Without it, human reproduction as we know it would be impossible. And guess where that gene comes from? A virus, Oscar said, the pieces clicking together in his mind. Exactly. An ancient retrovirus that infected our mammalian ancestors roughly 25 million years ago. What started as a potentially deadly infection eventually became an essential part of human reproduction. Julia stood up and walked closer to the hologram, studying the patterns with intense concentration. So we're not really just human, she murmured. We're like living museums of evolutionary warfare. The professor's eyes lit up at her observation. That's perhaps the most poetic way I've ever heard it described. Julia, yes, in a sense. We are living testimonies to every major viral pandemic our species has survived. Oscar began scribbling furiously in his notebook, trying to capture not just the facts but the philosophical implications of what they were learning. Does this mean that every pandemic we survive now could potentially alter our genetic code for future generations? Not necessarily, Professor Martinez explained. The viruses that became part of our genome were retroviruses, which have a specific mechanism for integrating into DNA. Most modern viruses don't work that way. However, there are still endogenous retroviruses in our genome that occasionally become active. Julia felt a mixture of awe and unease. So these ancient viruses, they're still there. They're still part of us. Most of them are inactive, essentially fossilized genetic remnants. But yes, they're there. In fact, some researchers believe that, under certain circumstances, stress or environmental factors might reactivate some of these dormant viral sequences. The room fell silent as both students absorbed this information. Oscar found himself thinking about his own family history, generations of ancestors who had survived plagues, pandemics, and diseases he couldn't even imagine. Each survival had potentially shaped not just their lives, but the very essence of what it meant to be human. It's humbling, Julia said finally, to think that what makes us human is partly defined by the viruses we've defeated. Professor Martinez nodded solemnly. It challenges our notion of biological purity, doesn't it? We like to think of ourselves as discrete organisms, separate from the microbial world, but the reality is far more complex. We are composite beings, shaped as much by our ancient enemies as by our evolutionary advantages. Oscar closed his notebook and looked up at the hologram one more time. So when people talk about fighting viruses, They're really talking about a war that's been going on for millions of years, and one that has fundamentally shaped who we are, Professor Martinez confirmed. Every victory our ancestors achieved against viral infections didn't just save their lives, it potentially altered the trajectory of human evolution itself. As the class period ended and students began filing out, Julia remained transfixed by the display. She thought about her own DNA, carrying within it the molecular memories of countless ancient battles between virus and host. It made her feel connected to something vast and timeless, an ongoing story of survival, adaptation, and unexpected cooperation between species. Walking out into the hallway beside Oscar, Julia realized that she would never think about being human in quite the same way again.